And off she went with a trumpety trump, 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 trump. So elephants are members of the family Elephantidae, and they're the only surviving members of the order Proboscidea, which used to contain other animals like mastodons. And elephants used to cover quite a lot of the world, used to get them across Africa, Eurasia, and North America. But today there's only 3 species. There is the Asian elephant, and the 2 African species, the African forest elephant and the African bush elephant, the latter of which is the largest land animal currently alive today. So elephants are pretty interesting animals. For starters, they look very unique. There isn't really anything else out there like an elephant, and elephants are pretty separate from pretty much every other type of big herbivore on Earth. Everything else is a type of ungulate. The most striking thing about an elephant, for starters, is its size. Elephants are massive animals, and they're among the largest types of mammals that have ever evolved. On land, certainly. The only ones that come close to them are the indracotheres and the giant ground sloths, both of which are extinct. And I think apart from their size, the main thing you notice about elephants is their trunk. So the elephant's trunk is a pretty unique bit of kit. So their nose is basically evolved into this massive muscular appendage, which basically functions as a 5th limb, basically an arm, and they use it for loads of stuff. They're able to pick things up, they use it for feeding, they use it to store water. They can store quite a lot of water, actually. It's very tactile. It's a pretty interesting thing to have, and nothing else that I can think of has actually evolved anything like that, both alive or extinct. Apart from that, they've obviously got very prominent ears, especially the African ones. They've got pretty massive ears that are used in thermoregulation. Extinct species like the mammoths had much shorter ears because they lived in colder environments. In fact, Asian elephants have shorter ears. Their tusks are also pretty prominent. It's basically their incisor teeth that have evolved into these really prolonged structures that they also use for a variety of things, whether that be foraging, scraping for salt, fighting, defense. So yeah, elephants have a lot of things that no other animal has, which I think helps make them stand out even more. I think elephants are probably one of the most recognizable animals on Earth. I think everyone knows what an elephant is. And as I said, there's 3 species currently alive today, the Asian elephant and the 2 African species. Now there are clear differences between Asian and African elephants. As I already mentioned, African elephants have much larger ears than Asian elephants, but there's loads of other things. Their skin's different. African elephants tend to have a lot more wrinkly skin, whereas Asian elephants is a bit smoother. You also tend to find they've got kind of pink spots on their skin as well. Asian elephants tend to have a bit more hair as well than African elephants. Even their toenails are different. African elephants have 4 toenails on their front feet and 3 in the back, whereas Asian elephants have 5 in the front and 4 in the back. Asian elephants have also got the kind of double domed heads, whereas African elephants is kind of more of a single dome. And finally, their trunks are different. African elephants have 2 fingers at the end of their trunks, whereas Asian elephants only have 1. It should also be noted that Asian elephants were actually more closely related to mammoths than they are to African elephants, and an Asian elephant and an African elephant would not be able to reproduce. And elephants of all species are also very social animals. They live in matriarchal herds. You've basically got female groups of related individuals. You've got mothers, grandmothers, aunties, sisters, nieces. They're all there, and they all kind of help out when it comes to looking after young and everything. And males tend to either be solitary or live in kind of small bachelor herds. And it's worth noting that elephants can actually remember other individuals that they've interacted with in the past. It's very obvious when you see elephants mixing with ones they haven't seen for quite a while. And you see that there is an element of joy that they have. There was actually 2 elephants in a zoo way back when they were introduced to each other, and they displayed quite a lot of joyful behaviours. And it turned out that they were actually in the same circus for a brief period of time, like 40 years before then. So you know, the expression, an elephant never forgets, is kind of true. And elephants are also pretty intelligent animals. They're obviously very good at problem solving, and elephants also display signs of grief. You see them when they encounter the bones of other elephants. They kind of hang around, and it's almost like they're paying their respects. I think there's also been a lot of cases of elephants that have lost their young, displaying quite a lot of panic. Mother elephants will stay with their young when they're dying. Elephants have also been noted to pass the mirror test, although it should be noted that that's just Asian elephants, but that does also show how intelligent they are. Like, I think we're pretty reluctant to admit that most animals are quite intelligent. When it comes to elephants, we're a bit more forgiving. We tend to be pretty fine with acknowledging that elephants are clever, kind of like dolphins or dogs in that sense. And I think ultimately people generally have quite a positive opinion of elephants, generally speaking. Even people I know that don't really like animals still like elephants. They're just animals that, you know, we kind of like and admire. And I think the reason for that is because we evolved alongside them. We obviously evolved alongside them in Africa, and obviously they were pretty big animals, pretty scary animals, and potentially really dangerous. But unlike a big predator, which you kind of need to be on your guard for pretty much whenever you were, elephants you can always see coming, or at least kind of hear them. And the best way of dealing with an elephant is just to keep out of his way. If you kind of don't bother it, it probably won't bother you. And I think that's something we probably learned pretty early on in our evolutionary history. But even when we left Africa, we went to Asia, elephants were there. When we went to Europe, elephants were there. We went to North America, there were mammoths there. Like, we've always kind of had elephants around for a long time until we basically killed all but 3 of the species. So I think there's almost an instinctive kind of respect that we have for them. And we do like to watch elephants, but we don't really like to see them suffer too heavily, at least knowingly. Like back in the Roman times, they did have elephants in the Colosseum, but people generally didn't like watching them get killed as much as they liked watching people or lions or wolves or horses or stuff get killed. But basically because they're so big, it's like taking down something that big, you kind of feel a bit humbled by it maybe. I don't know, something like that. But we've always kind of liked to watch elephants. Elephants were always really popular in zoos. They were probably the big attraction in zoos for a long time, which is kind of ironic because elephants don't really do that well in zoos because they're so social, so big, and so intelligent. But even aside from zoos, elephants were pretty popular in circuses for a long time. Again, something people like to see because they were so big and impressive animals, but ultimately it was actually really cruel. People also ride elephants, especially in Asia. You can't really do it with African species as much, but Asian elephants seem to be easier to sort of domesticate in that sense. You can't actually properly domesticate an elephant though. Basically, all the elephants that people ride or are used in national parks for rangers were ultimately all taken from their mothers at a young age, and were kind of enforced into this position. It's not the same as like with cattle or any other animals we've domesticated. It's actually not a very nice story. Again, we tend to like to be close to elephants, but we don't seem to have a very good way to do it. We all seem to be hurting the elephants. And the biggest example of that was the use of elephants in war. Elephants were basically ridden into battle with big armor on them, and a lot of the time they had like big spikes on their tusks as well. And this was basically just used to intimidate the enemy, but ultimately elephants weren't that great in war because they were easily spooked, and a lot of the time they needed to be stabbed in the back of the neck, so they wouldn't ultimately trample their own troops. The most famous example of elephants in war was probably Hannibal, who led his elephants from Tunisia through the Alps. And even in that sense, most of the elephants died of disease, and there was only one left by the time he got to Rome, and even it didn't really survive for very long after that. Elephants have been used for quite a few purposes throughout our history, but none of them have been really good for the elephants, and none of them have really been that efficient for us either. So maybe we should just leave them alone. I think people generally like elephants. That is until they have to live alongside them. Elephants, certainly in Africa, and probably actually more so in Asia, are the #1 animal when it comes to human-wildlife conflict. Way more than any predator. I think the only animal in Africa that comes anywhere near elephants is hippos, but even then it's a pretty substantial difference between the number of cases. Because they're so big and they need to eat so much, they can demolish an entire field of a farmer's crops and basically ruin their livelihood overnight. Elephants are also more than capable of destroying homes, especially angry elephants. If you get a big male elephant in must, they will probably go for you if they really want. I mean, I've been mock charged by a bull elephant in must, and I've got to say, it was pretty scary. And a few days after, that same elephant actually did charge someone properly. So, not great. It's a pretty intimidating thing to be around, and you do kind of feel humbled by them because there's not really much you can do against an elephant. And people have been killed by elephants. Getting killed by an elephant would probably be a pretty horrific way to go, either getting crushed by them or gored by the tusks. And there are things people can do to try and stop elephants going for their crops, like having bees around. Elephants tend to avoid places where there are beehives. Chilies, elephants don't like chili. That's a pretty well-known established thing. And actually shooting them with little chili bombs as well helps, because they're not lethal to the elephant, but they do scare them off. But ultimately, elephants are really clever animals, and if they do suss out a way around these deterrents, they will ultimately exploit them. So the problem's never really fully resolved. I remember seeing a guy in South Africa, and he said that if the elephant came near his property again, he was going to shoot it. So yeah, definitely living alongside elephants is something that's, sounds ideal on paper, but actually is pretty far from ideal. And elephants haven't really been doing that well over the last 100 or so years, and that is primarily due to the ivory trade. The ivory trade has been a big problem for elephants. I think more so for African elephants. Asian elephants, the females tend not to have tusks, but the males still do. And it's weird because ivory is not like rhino horn, whereby it's claimed that it's got medicinal purposes in Eastern medicine. Ivory is ultimately popular because it's a status symbol, especially for the rich, and mostly in East Asia. I think Japan is the worst offender for ivory, and ivory has been used for loads of stupid things like piano keys or even stamps over the years, and ultimately it's just, there's no need for it. And actually to kill an elephant for its ivory or to sell it actually carries a pretty hefty penalty in Africa. Unfortunately, this doesn't solve the problem of the organised criminals that, are causing the trade, but ultimately there's all this stockpiled ivory across Africa, and there is the argument that if they just started to legalise the trade of it and sold it, then it would, flood the market and it would stop the crime element. However, to counter that, it would also create a market for ivory, and ultimately the harvesting of this ivory requires to kill very big, very long-lived, very social and intelligent animals, and it's ultimately just not sustainable. So it's a debate that's been going on for quite a while now. It's not really going to stop anytime soon. And also it should be noted that the ivory trade has actually severely impacted the evolution of elephants, because you used to get these really big tusker elephants. Having big tusks on a male elephant was a really useful thing to have. However, since having big tusks makes you a target for ivory poachers, it's very, very rare to see a big tusker alive today. Most elephants have pretty short tusks comparatively to what they used to be. And that's only happened within the last 100 or so years. And that's both parts quite impressive and also quite sad. So yeah, to summarise, elephants are, pretty recognisable animals. We all know what an elephant looks like. They're probably one of the first animals you ever learn to recognise, and I think generally most people like them. We've always had an element of respect for them because we evolved alongside them. They're probably one of the animals we've had the longest histories with, and over the years we've continued to revere them, and we've just wanted to look at them, and we've wanted to use them for various things and get close to them, but that has very much been to the cost of the elephants. But despite the fact that we do generally like them, If we had to live alongside them, it's a very different story, and that reverence hasn't stopped us from exploiting them for their tusks, and that has not only driven the selective pressures on elephants, it's also limited their numbers by quite a sizable amount from what it was like 100 or so years ago. So maybe we should think more about the fact that if we do like elephants, maybe we should try and keep them around. So yeah, let me know what you thought of this video. Do you have any elephant stories? I actually did my dissertation on elephants in South Africa years ago, and I have seen them since, and they are pretty cool. They're probably one of my favourite animals. I really like elephants, as do most people, I think. So yeah, if you've got any crazy elephant stories, or you've got any, strong opinions of them you want to share, then let me know in the comments below. As ever, feel free to recommend me animals you'd like me to talk about in the future. And yeah, as ever, feel free to like, comment, and subscribe, or don't if you don't want to. It's perfectly fine. And I'll see you next time, and goodbye.